up, Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason Podcast. This is episode 14. I'm your host, Jonathan Drake. This is a pre-recorded episode. I will be working next weekend or when this airs. So I'm currently at work, not at work. Time travel, fun. I will hopefully be able to be in the chat depending on how things go at work. I have kind of like a Homer Simpson type job. I sit at a control screen and manage an automated process, take samples, and there's a lot of downtime. So hopefully I'll be able to be in the chat. Kind of a crazy week. Last week I was able to do the live stream, had the tornado pass by our house a few hours earlier. Had a chance to look at some of the damage this past week, and it's really quite sad. No one was hurt that I heard of, but there's a lot of homes that got pretty messed up. Crazy for end of December weather. Like I said, I would love to have natural weather. That'd be something to behold. I don't know if I've ever seen it. Not for a long time, maybe. I am feeling better too. I kind of turned a corner last couple of days, and I'm thankful for that. Got a lot of good sleep. Let's see. Happy New Year, 2026. Seems like overall in the Badlands community, there's an optimistic vibe, and I'm okay with that. We've got GART coming up here in April. Tickets have not yet gone on sale. April 9th through 12th in Nashville. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm hoping to be able to be there. It's within driving distance for me, so there's no excuse, really. But moving into it, last week, we began the historical basis for trial by jury by discussing what it means that the United States Constitution and the constitutions of all of the states all recognize trial by jury, but do not define it. This drives home the point that these documents did not create the rights they delineate, but acknowledged them. And that is absolutely true in the case of trial by jury. By acknowledging these rights, they admit a prior or pre-existing definition. And then because it is pre-existing, self-contained almost, then it exists outside of any modern attempts to redefine it. You cannot redefine something like trial by jury and then still claim to have preserved it or claim that it accomplishes the same things that it accomplished before you redefined it. We see the same nonsense going on today with the attempts to subvert natural and obvious things like gender. And again, referencing the Tina Peters situation and the despotic claim by Colorado's governor, so-called, that Tina Peters had been convicted by a jury of her peers, as if in this age of a redefined trial by jury, that means anything other than the government, via its avatar in the form of a lackey judge, informed the jury what they were to think and say, and they thought and said it. Making up new definitions isn't redefining something established. Rather, it's just making a new thing and trying to pawn it off as if it were the old thing. And this really works, or I should say, it really only works when, quote unquote, the people no longer remember the old thing. And herein lies the foundational goal of this entire show, at least as it pertains to the things that Spooner talks about. We saw also Spooner connecting trial by jury to the right to keep and bear arms under the umbrella of the natural right to resist tyranny. The natural right to resist tyranny is rooted in the natural right of self-defense against any trespasser. The only difference that comes with the trespasser being the government is that more social vigilance is required, and trial by jury was established precisely for that purpose. Considering that one of the primary means by which a government is going to trespass against your natural rights is by means of legislation and the subsequent attempts to enforce it, then it is clearly the right of everyone to resist laws they view as tyrannical, and the right of trial by jury is the legal means by which we may adjudicate that resistance. In Spooner's mind, there is no substantive difference between defending your home against some lowlife breaking in the middle of the night and using the same means of defense against some lowlife seeking to enforce government tyranny. This is precisely the understanding the founding fathers had of trial by jury, and precisely why it was codified in our founding documents. It's also important to point out that, leaning on all of the reasons Spooner has given us for why the Constitution is invalid, and if you're not clear as to what those are, the first 10 episodes of this show deal with his essay, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, in which he lays out a comprehensive argument for why the Constitution is invalid. So in light of all that, it's important to point out that all of our founding documents are either patent frauds or are being used fraudulently. In that light, I believe the founding story we've been told is in large part a fairy tale, because in light of the reality we live in, the platitudes we celebrate on the 4th of July ultimately are just childish copium. Because as we celebrate the right to bear arms as being the security of our liberty, people often saying the second guarantees the first, the very government that right is meant to protect us from has, in practice, made the exercise of that right to the end for which it was delineated abjectly illegal. And by gutting trial by jury of everything except the shell of a skin suit, they have deprived us of the means by which to declare the government's overreach illegal through acquitting those who would defend themselves. Left to its own devices, a government will always declare disobedience to itself illegal. And as Spooner points out, left to its own devices, a government will always declare its own actions to be lawful and constitutional, with rare exception. As I've stated a number of times already, I don't find any value in softening the emotional blow of reality with euphemism. And as we look forward to this coming golden age, we're only going to avoid the mistakes of the past if we can rightly identify them and not do them again. So in that light, tonight we will move forward in the historical view of trial by jury by taking a look at Magna Carta. One of the reasons why the founding generation, men who were thoroughly schooled in the tradition of English common law, held so tightly to the idea that the consenting governed judge the law and hold the government accountable by means of a jury. But first, introducing Silent, empower your right to disconnect with Silent Faraday cage bags. In a world where tech never sleeps, our mission is to keep you safe, private, and healthy. Our patented technology shields your devices from hacking, tracking, and EMF radiation, giving you autonomy over your digital life. Disconnecting sparks creativity, strengthens relationships, and brings peace of mind. With Silent, you get effortless gear built with integrity, always staying one step ahead to protect your data and security. Choose Silent and reclaim your freedom to disconnect. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/Faraday and use promo code Badlands to snag your 10% discount. That's badlandsmedia.tv/Faraday, promo code Badlands. Next up, when your favorite Badlands show wraps up in probably just slightly less than an hour, head straight to the Badlands shop to discover our hand-picked sponsors and exclusive deals. From premium USA-made health supplements and grass-fed meats to patriotic apparel, secure tech gear, and veteran-owned coffee, we've got everything to fuel your America First lifestyle. Whether it's products spotlighted on the air or essentials for your daily grind, the Badlands shop makes it simple to shop smart and support the cause. Every dollar you spend is a bold stand for freedom, backing patriot entrepreneurs, family-run businesses, and creators who champion our shared values. You're not just grabbing great gear, you're powering the movement that keeps Badlands Media strong. Thanks for choosing businesses that stand with Badlands. Your support keeps the truth rolling. Dive in now at badlandsmedia.tv/shop or click shop from the main menu at badlandsmedia.tv. And then last but certainly not least, the latest offering from Soft Disclosure.
Get you some of that beard oil.
Now that I'm alone at the close-up, do you see how awesome my beard looks right now?
I use the beard oil every single day. First thing. Comes out feeling all silky smooth. I take the dropper and I manually apply the oil directly to my mustache. Nice and, oh man, I love it. And then I do drops all throughout the hair and then I just rub it all in. And then I top it off with the tallow stick on the face.
But I feel like I have to grow a beard just to try this beard oil. It sounds
Do it, Jay.
amazing.
It's all from softdisclosure.com, and the best part about it is you will be supporting Badlands Media, Annie from Willow and Farms, and basically 3 of Annie's neighbors. So that's 5 total American companies that you'd be supporting with one purchase.
I have been using the Soft Disclosure scentless beard oil every day after the shower. It looks unkempt, but it feels silky smooth. I want to look a little wild and unapproachable, but for the woman I trust, she'll be like, oh, it's actually kind of soft. He is approachable after all. Otherwise, stay away. And Soft Disclosure will help you too with that if that's the very specific vibe you're going for.
That is very specific, yes.
You guys are supporting American businesses when you do that. It's absolutely incredible, and you get a great, great product.
So I have not developed a regimen enough to have a way that I apply the soft disclosure beard oil, but I did finally get some recently, and I have started to use it. It's a little early for me to give a full scale review, but so far I have to say the smell is very pleasant. I have the spiced vanilla, and I also have the the naked unscented, and I do like the smell, and the feel afterwards is definitely different than what I'm used to, especially this time of year. Here in the Midwest, we get very dry, and so I do get my beard will get kind of crackly and dry. I also, speaking not of the beard oil, this time of year, I never used to struggle with this. I would get my hands would get so dry, and I like to work with my hands a lot. I'm always, woodworking and in the shop or whatever. My hands are nicked and scraped and scarred and bruised and all sorts of things. But This time of year, over the last couple of years, like my knuckles would actually start to crack and like actually like just hurt. And I started using the soft disclosure lotion, and I am very impressed because I've been using it now for almost a week, and like all of this week. And even within just a few days, I've noticed a tremendous difference. So the hype is real, folks. And also, my wife was trying out the deodorant and was skeptical because her experience with natural deodorants is that they do not deodor and they don't last. So far, she has a standing desk, and she walks 5 or 6 miles a day while working at her computer. And so one can get rank while doing that. And so far, she's been impressed at keeping the stench at bay. And I'm sure she would be horrified that I would refer to anything that she could possibly emit as a stench. But, well, there you have it. So soft disclosure, it's not just hype. It's not just advertising mumbo jumbo. It's real. And as I use the beard oil more, I'm interested to see how that has an impact, especially on my skin underneath, because during this time of year, it can get dry as well. So, yeah, the hype's real. Okay, let's move forward. Which I mentioned last week. I need to trim. My wife literally just mentioned that to me tonight. She's like, "Yeah, I'm not interested in kissing a Wookiee, so I need to get this under control." And I don't know. We'll see. We're going on point of housekeeping. Next week, I will not have a show. We'll be out of town, and so that's one of the reasons why she wants me to somewhat look presentable, because we're going to be going on a vacation with some friends of ours, and I need to look presentable and not like a hobo. So anyway, last week there were some Rumble rants that I missed. Polymathonon said, Jonathan, appreciate your work and dedication to the truth. Thank you, brother. And I appreciate that. I was not prepared for how much work doing a show like this would actually be. I mentioned, I initially had the rather humorous goal of 15-minute episodes. And then as I was talking with Polymath and Beth prior to getting this whole thing off the ground, it's like, well, maybe you should do half an hour, because by the time you get through introductions and stuff, you might be well into that. So like I had the goal of half-hour episodes, and I've never come close to that. So I've just given up on that. But it makes me marvel at guys like Chris, who would do the 3-hour-long live streams each week, and then the almost half-hour, 45-minute long shows 5 days a week for a couple years prior to that. That's a lot of work. It's an absolute lot of work. And I will say I'm enjoying it, though. Digging into this material and understanding it at levels that I didn't even previously understand it is incredibly rewarding. I hope it is for all of you as well. And, can be a good resource for when you're talking with people and try to talk about concepts like natural law and trial by jury. This is a good resource that you can point them to, and let someone else explain it, and then ultimately read Spooner's writings himself, yourself, and dig into that stuff. I will say, though, having read them a number of times and then actually digging into them for the purpose of turning around and teaching them, they say you tend to assimilate things more clearly when you turn around and teach them. It's been incredibly rewarding. So it's my absolute pleasure to do this. And as I've said many times, and will say many times more, I'm grateful to John and Badlands for putting up with this. Because it's not every day that you have a show that says the Constitution is a worthless document fit for the trash heap of history. B. Klepetsky dropped a rant saying brilliant. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily 100% disagree with you, but I do appreciate that. Says was first exposed to natural law when I did the Project 2025 lessons. Love it. I wasn't familiar with what that is. I guess Project 2025 had a bunch of, I looked this up afterwards, a bunch of supplemental material that had lessons in it or something, and they mentioned natural law, and I'm not sure the full context. I was going to say it's not a phrase that you're going to hear a lot of, especially in like conning influencer standard tickle fight on Twitter type forums. You're not going to get analysis to the level where someone's going to be trying to pull from natural law or try to extrapolate from natural law. And that's what I love about Badlands, is that you're going to get that type of analysis from pretty much everybody here. And that's what needs to happen. That's the kind of analysis that was happening in the founding era. And that's needs to happen now in the refounding era. B. Klepetsky dropped $17 after that and said, I wanted to send 17. And to that, I say thank you. So you can spell thank you however you want. To that point, also, you can go to badlandsmedia.tv/boost. If you would like to support Badlands Media as a whole, you can drop boosts for the entire company. You can drop them for your favorite show. I will let you decide what that is. Any support is certainly appreciated, but not necessary, because I'm doing this because I love to do it. And it is not, I mean, some of this stuff does get a little expensive. I was kind of taking it back, to try to make sure the sound quality doesn't sound like a tin can like I happened a couple weeks ago. Any support you guys want to drop is appreciated. But like I said, you can also just support the entire company. You don't have to pick a specific show. Anyway, that being aside, Magna Carta. Spooner begins his discussion on Magna Carta in Chapter 2, Section 1, entitled The History of Magna Carta. And he opens, pull this up. In order to judge of the object and meaning of that chapter of Magna Carta, which secures trial by jury, it is to be borne in mind that at the time of Magna Carta, the king, with exceptions immaterial to this discussion, but which will appear hereafter, was constitutionally the entire government, the sole legislative, judicial, and executive power of the nation. The executive and judicial officers were merely his servants, appointed by him and removable at his pleasure. The king was, therefore, constitutionally the government, and the only legal limitation upon his power seems to have been simply a common law, usually called the law of the land, which he was bound by oath to maintain. And then here we get commentary that Spooner, you should have come to expect from Spooner. He says, which oath had about the same practical value as similar oaths have always had. If you remember our discussion on oaths from No Treason, they are idle wind. He goes on, this law of the land seems not to have been regarded at all by many of the kings, except so far as they found it convenient to do so, or were constrained to observe it by the fear of arousing resistance. But as all people are slow in making resistance, oppression and usurpation often reached a great height. And in the case of John, they had become so intolerable as to enlist the nation almost universally against him, and he was reduced to the necessity of complying with any terms the barons saw fit to dictate to him. Magna Carta is the great charter. This was in 1215 in England, and this is referring to John. That would be King John, infamous in the Robin Hood narratives, same time frame. So the background for this is that England was 150 years into the Norman era. Norman invaders coming from mainland France, that is from Normandy, as in like Omaha Beach. They were descended from Vikings who had settled the area about 150 years earlier. So the Normans invaded England to make good on certain claims to the throne after the last Anglo-Saxon king had died. William the Conqueror leads the charge, invading Britain and achieving military and political dominance at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So a few years ago. By the year 1086, so just 20 years after the invasion, the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the political system they represented was thoroughly rooted out and replaced, which is reflected in a comprehensive census of the land and down to like the plows and carts and donkeys and everything, called the Domesday Book. This record of English nobility and everything they owned and all the people underneath them shows that by that point, the nobility was entirely Norman. They had completely, the people were the same, but the elite level, the elite class had been thoroughly replaced. The Normans brought an entirely different political structure with them. Under the Anglo-Saxons, which Spooner will discuss their mode of culture and in some later chapters, and we'll go more in depth at that point. But under the Anglo-Saxons, the king was guardian of law, not the source of it. Kings were selected in many cases by merit, not by birthright, which led to many of them being the best man among men. And this is drawing from the Germanic tribal traditions that were described by Tacitus in his book Germania, going back to the Roman days. Justice was meted by the people on a community basis. Royal decree was treated more like counsel to that end rather than decree. Legal self-determination was recognized as the norm. Private land ownership was protected and was commonplace. Throughout certain periods of this Anglo-Saxon time, you could argue that this was the freest that man has ever been within an organized political structure, with liberty being defined as an unencumbered exercise of natural rights. This realization was rather surprising to me. And I'm sure I'll touch on that more. I'm still kind of piecing through all that, but it really does seem like the Anglo-Saxons had figured a lot of things out. But under the Normans, the king was the source of the law. He was the sole sovereign. He was the head of whatever government existed, creating legal dynasties, so passing on from father to son, etc. Private land ownership, and this is key, referred to as allodial ownership. Allodial meaning complete, unconditional, inheritable ownership, was effectively abolished. Under the Norman system, the whole land was claimed and belonged to the crown, and the nobility were merely tenants. This system more or less became the standard and has never been repealed. So technically, even today, the crown owns all of the land under its jurisdiction. Property tax was paid and is paid because as a baron or even a common person today in England or anywhere in the Commonwealth, you never actually own your land. Does that sound familiar? Try stopping paying your property taxes. You find out, holy crap, we live in a Norman system of state ownership of the land. As Spooner describes, the king or the sovereign, i.e. the crown, was constitutionally the entire government. So what prompted the charter? King John in the Norman, he was the great-great-grandson of William the Conqueror, and he was particularly feckless, made quite a mess of the country, of crown claims and whatnot to certain parts of France, like the Normandy area. But the barons complained because he was making use of a system making overuse of a system that had been created by his predecessors, of essentially turning the country into a massive piggy bank for royal excesses. This was a system that was supported by the barons because it did make them rich. Again, these are all Norman by this point. But at some point, even they got a little tired of the excess. The Magna Carta was, or rather, the royal excesses engaged in by John was a predictable result of the Norman centralization of power. If you give one man total power, it's going to go to his head, especially if they're inbred. This is juxtaposed to the decentralized administration of Anglo-Saxon culture, which tended to keep its sovereigns or its kings in check pretty well. The barons went along with this system as long as it benefited them, but John seems to have lost sight of the give and take relationship necessary between the crown and its supporting nobility. Often the king spent his time traveling the country collecting revenue, reminding them that he's there, and you need the nobility to go along with the charade in order to squeeze the populace. And John seems to have forgotten that dependent relationship. The value of memorizing every little historical detail of this time period is debatable. But suffice it to say, by the time of the Magna Carta, John had lost significant portions of the crown's claims back in France. He had endured major military setbacks and was trying to squeeze an already squeezed population with more taxes to fund his feuds with everyone from the King of France to the Pope. Because John couldn't help himself meddling in church business, trying to sell church office positions, even led to him being excommunicated for quibbling about who would take over the Archbishop of Canterbury. Which is ironic because it was the Archbishop of Canterbury who ended up serving as the ad hoc mediator between the disaffected barons and the toxic John once he was reinstated within the church. So the Magna Carta itself, it is comprised of 63 clauses, sometimes referred to as chapters. They are hyper-specific descriptions or responses of descriptions of responses to specific abuses of power by John, and even going back to his predecessors. They speak of tremendous financial overreach, insufferable judicial hypocrisy, sacrilegious meddling with the affairs of the church, which was especially frowned upon once John submitted to the Pope in the manner in which the entire country was made a de facto fiefdom of the church, something I did not realize. John was using legal authority as a means of extortion. In other words, lawfare. And apart from the meddling of the affairs of the church, although you could probably argue that goes on today as well, you could read the list so far as being descriptive of the United States government today and any of the state governments. The charter was drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who is a fascinating character. And I have designs of doing more research into him and the things that he wrote about. Apparently, he was a rather prolific writer, although not everything was preserved. There's a lot of inference as to what he taught, but he was a fascinating spiritual theologian, political philosopher type, considering the fact that he helped to draft a lot of the charter. He seems to have been the driving horse, if you will, of the Magna Carta, to coin a burning bright phrase. Langton reminded the barons of something called the Charter of Liberties, which was Henry I's admission that Henry I is the son of William the Conqueror, so a couple kings earlier. he had written something called the Charter of Liberties, which was Henry I's admission of wrongdoing against English common law as enumerated by Edward the Confessor, who was the last Anglo-Saxon king. And the Charter of Liberties failed because it was essentially just a pinky promise to not be so terrible. There wasn't really any teeth to it. But the list of problems that the barons were facing with John were very similar to what was being faced against Henry I. And so Langton pointed to the Charter of Liberties to say that there was a law higher than the king that they could appeal to. So this served the purpose of reframing their rebellion as not usurping a rightful monarch, but as restoring an ancient law and holding a contracted party, i.e. the king, to his end of the bargain, since even Norman kings swore an oath to uphold the law of the land. They very rarely followed that oath, and to Spooner's point, that's because oaths are meaningless. But in at least an attempt at morality, Langton was able to use those facts to justify, as an officer of the church, to justify the actions of the barons of holding John accountable. He brought a theological scholarship to the table with a focus on biblical kingship. Apparently, that was a specialty of his. He considered monarchs as submissive to God's law and not as laws unto themselves. You can look at Deuteronomy 17, I think it's 14 through 20 or something like that. 14 through the end of the chapter outlines what any Israelite king was to be modeled after, and certainly not thinking that they could rise above God's law. And so if it was no different, if that was the standard for an Israelite king, it's no different for an English king. There is a law that God has established, and you as a king may not break that law, and you may be held accountable in the same way that anyone else who breaks God's law can be held accountable. This implies that obedience to a tyrant is conditional, or obedience to any government is conditional. And it brings up a fascinating angle and interpretation on Romans 13, which has often been used to browbeat Christians into submitting to tyrannical government. And obviously there's a lot of debate on that. That's a whole topic on its own. And at some point I'll probably get into that, because that is certainly an interesting angle of discussion that is worth discussing and digging into. And having someone like Langton as a historical perspective on that is worthwhile. The invocation of Henry I's Charter of Liberties and Henry I's invocation of Edward the Confessor's law is essentially direct proof of this idea that Magna Carta was appealing to an already ancient law that prior to the Norman invasion, and even after, if their oaths were to be taken seriously, kings were bound to guard and uphold. And this places the dictum of Clause 39, which is the one that deals with trial by jury, squarely in the don't even think about trying to redefine this column. And more on this later, since this gets at the heart of the attacks on trial by jury that Spooner is so interested in. Now, interestingly enough, Magna Carta was basically a failure. King John immediately appealed to the Pope, Innocent III, who immediately annulled the charter via a papal bull, which actually has been preserved, so we can get insight into what the Pope thought of what the barons were doing. So, given the amount of time it would take to send word to the Pope and then have the word come back, the charter stayed in effect for just about 2.5 months. And then as soon as the word was received from the Pope annulling the charter, it was immediately annulled by John. Which is interesting because Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a high-ranking church official, was actually the Pope's choice for the Archbishop position, and John was not a fan of that choice, and that led to him being excommunicated for a spell. So that's interesting. It's like, okay. But after the charter was repealed, civil war resumed, and it seems like there was a period of time where it was kind of an ebb and flowing of various rebellions. And then over the years, the charter would get reinstated and get revised and watered down. And then eventually Parliament kind of took over and evolved into over a number of centuries to the point where the charter was less and less relevant in English life. So given basically its failure, it's kind of strange that the Magna Carta gets the attention that it does. It's celebrated, I think it was June 15th, I want to say, is when it was signed. That still gets celebrated over in England as if they somehow have liberty over there. But this brings us to the attempts to reshape the Magna Carta's legacy, and then brings us to the beginning of Spooner's analysis of the charter itself. And the legacy is shaped, of course, in controversy, like anything pertaining to liberty. And I will let Wikipedia do the frame the controversy for us, because you can always count on Wikipedia to give you the most statist perspective on pretty much anything. At the end of the 16th century, there was an upsurge of interest in Magna Carta. Lawyers and historians at the time believed that there was an ancient English constitution going back to the days of the Anglo-Saxons that protected individual English freedoms. They argued that the Norman invasion of 1066 had overthrown these rights, and that Magna Carta had been a popular attempt to restore them, making the charter an essential foundation for the contemporary powers of Parliament and legal principles such as habeas corpus. Although this historical account was badly flawed, jurists such as Sir Edward Coke invoked Magna Carta extensively in the early 17th century, arguing against the divine right of kings. Both James I and his son Charles I attempted to suppress the discussion of Magna Carta. The political myth of Magna Carta as a medieval revival of ancient personal liberties persisted after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 until well into the 19th century. It influenced the early American colonists in the 13 colonies and the formation of the United States Constitution, which became the supreme law of the land in the new Republic of the United States. Research by Victorian historians showed that the original 1215 charter had concerned the medieval relationship between the monarch and the barons, and not ordinary subjects. The majority of historians now see the interpretation of the charter as a unique and early charter of universal legal rights as a myth that was created centuries later. So there are a number of things in that glorious Wikipedia excerpt that will be specifically addressed by Spooner. But first, notice the line, the majority of historians now see the interpretation of the charter as a unique and early charter of universal legal rights as a myth that was created centuries later. First of all, appeal to consensus should be your first indication that probably the exact opposite of this is true. But this is a claim that Spooner decided was worth spending considerable time dispelling, and so we'll get into that. One thing that this Wikipedia excerpt got correct was that there was a resurgence of interest in later centuries in the claims of the charter, and the revitalization of the examination of the charter as a means to bolster English and then later American liberties, especially with respect to trial by jury, since trial by jury is the linchpin of Magna Carta. To a significant extent, these efforts were successful, which is something that we should take note of for our time. In the 16 and 1700s, there were notable cases in which juries nullified laws they determined to be unjust, even facing direct persecution from the crown for doing so. Juries were literally imprisoned for contempt in nullifying laws they considered to be unjust. This speaks to the fact that the revitalization efforts had reached even down to the common man, those who would be sitting on a jury, enabling him to possess an understanding of his power as a juror, and that it was a power worth sacrificing for and undergoing persecution for and not budging. One of the significant cases was in 1670, referred to as Bushel's case. I didn't do an extensive reading into that, but it was involving William Penn of Pennsylvania fame. And a jury acquitted William Penn despite a clear violation of written law. And this case apparently served as a foundation, early form of precedent for later cases acknowledging the right of a jury to nullify law. Another case that is not quite contemporary to the founders, slightly earlier, but it was in 1735, was the Zenger trial. The jury ignored judges' explicit instructions and acquitted John Zenger in the face of blatant violation of a written law that the jury obviously felt was a bad law. These are cases that the founders would have been absolutely aware of, especially given many of them being trained lawyers. Sir William Blackstone, the premier legal academic authority in the 1700s, he wrote the heavily referenced Commentaries on English Law, which is a massive collection of volumes. He notably called the trial by jury the Palladium of Liberty. You've heard that expression already. Blackstone didn't coin that, but he is most often associated with that phrase. Palladium being the defense of, the protection of liberty. He referenced the Magna Carta as being rooted in natural law, and that natural law supersedes any sovereign. These are obviously dangerous ideas to any king, any tyrant. And this is the resurgence that happened many years later that created this myth. But we'll see that that's ridiculous here in just a minute. This legacy ultimately culminated in the creation of the United States with the centralizing constitution, as well as each of the state constitutions, all recognizing trial by jury, as we've discussed, as already ancient, rooted in natural law, and thus self-defined, and essential as a means by which the governed, whose consent must be honored, convey their consent. Juries nullifying the law was a common occurrence in the founder era, and that common understanding was carried into the new country. So this is the background then against which Spooner writes his essay, originally published in 1852, just 64 years after the Constitution was ratified, which is kind of sobering because in those short years, and really even shorter, since Joseph Story's aggressive attacks on trial by jury began in 1835, trial by jury went from being a vaunted, well-practiced, broadly understood safeguard against tyranny to a shell of its former practice, and even more damage has been done since then. This abandonment is a slower process than what happened with the Magna Carta, but it still sort of mirrors the speed at which the guarantees of Magna Carta were discarded. I would say it's notable that the discarding of Magna Carta, the discarding of these liberties, follows the institution of constitutional promises. It seems like when we write these things down, something happens in our brains that just sort of removes that urgency. The enforcement of centralized legal authority and centralized legal definition further erodes the vigilance of the populace. They've got it. They'll take care of it. Someone else will take care of it. It's not up to me. We have the proliferation of supposed representative legislative government and the idea that our liberties are safe with our representatives. And look where that has gotten us today. So the claims that were outlined in the Wikipedia article, which Spooner actually ends up covering, obviously not as a result of the Wikipedia article. It's interesting, the Wikipedia article, it's almost written in like a direct response to the things that Spooner talks about. But the claims that are outlined there are clearly false. But even if they were true, the resurgence in the era leading up to the founding of this country demonstrates the effectiveness of the concept of trial by jury, because juries were using trial by jury effectively, and it was really pissing off the king, which is, that starts getting to the whole Admiralty Court, and that's one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, that the king was depriving the people of trial by jury, and literally just like they would arrest people, transport them across the Atlantic back to England, and try them in courts where they didn't have a jury trial. And that was one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, which I read that a couple weeks ago, I think. So Spooner's goal, and thus my goal, is to push back against any attempts to redefine trial by jury, any attempts to revise its history, and ultimately the goal is to remind people of our true heritage. So continuing that and getting into the answer to the claims made by the Wikipedia article, Spooner writes that the barons compelled him, that is King John, as the price of his throne, to pledge himself that he would punish no free man for a violation of any of his laws unless with the consent of his peers, that is, the equals of the accused. The question here arises whether the barons and the people intended that those peers, the jury, should be mere puppets in the hands of the king, exercising no opinion of their own as the intrinsic merits of the accusations they should try. Oh, I need to pull this up. They should try, or the justice of the laws they should be called on to enforce. Whether those haughty and victorious barons, when they had their tyrant king at their feet, gave back to him his throne with full power to enact any tyrannical laws he might please, reserving only to a jury, that is, the country, the contemptible and servile privilege of ascertaining, under the dictation of the king or his judges as to the laws of evidence, the simple fact whether those laws had been transgressed? Was this the only restraint which, when they had all power in their hands, they placed upon the tyranny of a king whose oppressions they had risen in arms to resist? Was it to obtain such a charter as that the whole nation had united, as it were, like one man against their king? Was it on such a charter that they intended to rely for all future time for the security of their liberties? No. They were engaged in no senseless work as that. On the contrary, when they required him to renounce forever the power to punish any free man, unless by the consent of his peers, they intended those peers should judge of and try the whole case on its merits, independently of all arbitrary legislation or judicial authority on the part of the king. In this way, they took the liberties of each individual, and thus the liberties of the whole people. That is such a huge point. There is no such thing as a liberty of the whole people if the liberties of the individuals are not preserved. The consent of each individual. This to make a sidebar on voting, sidebar on representative government. Unless you specifically give your consent or you specifically designate a representative, no one can represent you. Republican government is a psyop. Anyway, in this way, they took the liberties of each individual and thus the liberties of the whole people entirely out of the hands of the king and out of the power of his laws, and placed them in the keeping of the people themselves. And this it was that made the trial by jury the palladium of their liberties. The trial by jury, be it observed, was the only real barrier interposed by them against absolute despotism. So the argument of the revisionist historians the Victorian researchers, is rebuffed in granular detail in Spooner's upcoming treatment of the original Latin, but he presents here an argument from basic human nature, something that we could identify with. Why would the barons engage in brutal warfare and win, face excommunication from the church, demand concessions, demand the restoration of a practice like trial by jury, appealing to established custom, because they reference the law of the land, and that has very specific meaning at that time, if it didn't mean exactly what later legal historians claimed it meant during the resurgence, when the myth was created? Why would they virtually depose a king? Or not virtually, but why would they actually essentially depose a king, just to put him back again, unless they had obtained some guarantee and made some substantive change represented by trial by jury? The claim that trial by jury, being the Palladium of liberty, is just an invention of later romanticized legal theories immediately falls flat just from that basic argument right there. Now, that the Magna Carta failed to restrain the crown isn't support for the revisionist historians, but rather it demonstrates Spooner's point throughout No Treason and throughout any of his writings, because these ideas keep coming up, that a constitution or a charter is a worthless protection against tyranny if the people neglect their end of the bargain. That's exactly what happened. That's what happened in England. That's what happened in this country. Further repudiation of the revisionist claim comes from John's recorded reasons for initially refusing to sign the charter. So the first repudiation comes from the fact that it makes no sense why the barons would go through all the trouble that they did if trial by jury wasn't what the later legal historians acknowledged it being. But then John's response to it also informs against that claim. Spooner writes, besides, if his laws were to be authoritative with the jury, why should John indignantly refuse, as he first did, to grant the charter, and finally grant it only when brought to the last extremity, on the ground that it deprived him of all power and left him only the name of a king? And this is what I was referring to when I made the comment at Deadwood back in August. John evidently understood that the juries were to veto his laws and paralyze his power at discretion by forming their own opinions as to the true character of the offenses they were to try and the laws they were to be called on to enforce, and that the king wills and commands was to have no weight with them, contrary to their own judgments of what was intrinsically right. The record of this refusal, you can ask, how do we know such things? And as Chris Paul would say, it's information among other information. But the record of this refusal is preserved in various historical writings. Spooner quotes from Lawrence Echard, 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 maybe. His book from, I think it's from like the 15 or 1600s, The History of England. And Echard was drawing heavily from a contemporary historian of the Magna Carta from the early 13th century, a guy named Roger of Wendover, in his book Flores Historiarum. I was never very good at Latin. Wendover records John as falling into a violent passion and asking why the barons did not, with these exactions, demand his kingdom. So he recognized what the barons were doing was essentially taking away his kingdom. Echard also records the reactions of the Pope as essentially saying the same thing, that the barons would depose a king and strip him of his throne. But Spooner concludes Ishard's assessment by saying that these things show that the nature and effect of the charter were well understood by the king and his friends, that they all agreed that he was effectively stripped of power. Yet the legislative power had not been taken from him, but only the power to enforce his laws, unless juries should freely consent to their enforcement. Make whatever law you want, dude. We will enforce the ones we think should be there. That's the way it should be. To this point, with a trial by jury, you could have a king. You could have a parliament. You could have whatever. Make Trump king for the rest of his life. I don't care. If we have trial by jury, it does not matter, because ultimately trial by jury, when exercised by a population that understands what it is and what it does, gives us the actual rubber meets the road of for and by the people. Spooner concludes section 1, which again was titled The History of Magna Carta, by saying this charter, in its most essential features, and without any abatement as to the trial by jury, has since been confirmed more than 30 times. He's referring to the number of times the charter was reestablished. And the people of England have always had a traditionary idea that it was of some value as a guarantee against oppression. Yet that idea has been an entire delusion unless the jury have had the right to judge of the justice of the laws they were called on to enforce. So that is the answer to the initial claim that the Magna Carta somehow elevated trial by jury to this awesome status of essentially being a government, an impromptu, randomly selected government. The argument is that obviously the barons would not undergo such efforts if they weren't getting something that actually did anything. The English people would have been in a state of delusion for centuries, thinking that trial by jury somehow gave them something. And then the resurgence, according to these Victorian historians, the resurgence in the 1600s and 1700s under guys like Blackstone, and then picked up by Patrick Henry and John Adams, and then later on Spooner. Those guys were picking up on something that was actually there. So thus we have the common sense rebuttal to the revisionist claims that were exemplified by this ridiculous Wikipedia article. The sticking point was that trial by jury was trial by jury. And King John recognized that if a jury could refuse to enforce his laws, then he was effectively just the figurehead. So the sticking point of Magna Carta was Clause 39. All of the other 62 clauses then rest on that clause. If that clause does not carry the weight that it is claimed to carry, then the rest of the clauses are meaningless. And for our purposes, they effectively are. I mean, they're dealing with, some of them are broad enough topics that we can apply them today, but the one that's really worth holding on to is trial by jury. The historical record of John's response, the preserved papal bull from Pope Innocent III, and the fact that it doesn't make any sense to go through all that trouble of securing the charter if it did not in some way dramatically alter the previous arrangement, all of that point to the understanding of trial by jury that Spooner talks about. And that points it to that being the proper understanding of the Magna Carta. Spooner's is not a historical revision. His perspective is not a historical revision. Because the only way that John and the Pope respond as they do is if the Magna Carta establishes trial by jury exactly as Spooner describes it. So, next episode, not next week since I will be out of town, we'll follow Spooner as he gets into the weeds of the actual wording of Magna Carta, since one angle of attack by the revisionists is to claim certain favorable translations to their statist ends in the original Latin. And I'm going to try not to get too thick into the weeds on that, because I know that could probably end up being boring. But there's some relevant information in there that's in chapter 2, section 2, on the language of Magna Carta. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for joining me. Happy New Year to every one of you. Keep your eyes out for the GART Nashville tickets once they get announced. And make sure you support the Badlands sponsors. Take care.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.